In the bitter cold of Warsaw's 1887 winter, a woman by the name of Ewa Zielinska quietly moved into the city's crumbling Praga district. It was a place where poverty clung to the stone streets like fog, and the people, hardened by years of political turmoil and superstition, relied more on whispers than facts. Eva came with nothing more than a weathered trunk, a wooden cradle, and a reputation that trailed her like a shadow, one that the locals didn't fully understand but instinctively feared. She was a midwife, that much was clear, and in a city already plagued by infant mortality and disease, her arrival should have been welcomed. Instead, it raised eyebrows, not because of what she did, but how she did it. Within mere weeks, Eva became the name on every tongue, always spoken in hushed tones. She offered her services to families who couldn't afford hospital births, bringing her own potions, herbs, and talismans to each home. But soon the births she attended began to attract attention for reasons no midwife would ever want. Babies born under Eva's care were different. Some were born unusually silent, their eyes wide open and fixed as if they were watching something the rest of the room couldn't see. Others came into the world screaming, but not with the usual shrill cries of a newborn. Their wails were said to sound more like the howling of wind through a keyhole, long, low, and unnatural. More disturbingly, many of the newborns bore strange markings, small red shapes on their spines or necks that didn't resemble rashes or bruises, but symbols. Some claimed they looked like runes, others like slashes made with a hot needle. Parents tried to brush it off at first, chalking it up to birth trauma or superstition. But when these markings appeared consistently among children from entirely unrelated families, suspicion began to grow. Mothers who had given birth under Eva's supervision began to fall ill, not the ordinary postpartum ailments, but sudden, wasting illnesses that left them pale and hollow-eyed. Some died within days, others lingered for weeks, muttering feverishly about shadows in their homes, strange dreams of being watched while they slept, or of hearing a lullaby in a language they couldn't understand. Still, no one dared confront Eva directly. Her calm demeanor, her precise movements, and the eerie calm that followed her into any room made people uneasy. Even skeptical doctors avoided crossing her. It was said that her presence brought a coldness that seemed to settle deep in the bones, and many spoke of a strange scent that clung to her garments, not foul but heavy, like soil after rain mixed with something metallic. She wore an old rosary around her wrist, though no one ever saw her pray, and on her belt hung a ring of tiny bells that never seemed to make a sound when she walked. The city's working-class women, desperate for care they could afford, kept calling on her despite the growing unease. Eva always arrived just before the birth pangs began, even if no message had been sent for her. Some believed she could sense labor before it started, arriving at doorsteps moments before the first contractions. Others swore they saw her simply appear out of the shadows, already prepared, already knowing the child's gender and the outcome of the labor before the first cry. And yet, for all the strange occurrences, her success rate was undeniable. Most of the babies survived. In a time when childbirth was as likely to kill as it was to create life, this alone made her services invaluable. But what truly unsettled the neighborhood wasn't just the strange circumstances of the births or the symbols, it was what came afterward. The children she helped bring into the world were different, quiet, watchful. Some never cried. Some stared at nothing for hours. A few, according to shaken parents, began speaking full sentences far too early, sometimes in dialects their families didn't know. As word of her spread beyond the slums, wealthier families stayed away, unwilling to risk the consequences. But the desperate, and there were many, continued to invite her in. And so the pattern continued. The strange births, the whispering illnesses, the babies with marks, and above it all, the sense that something ancient and unseen walked with Eva wherever she went, moving just behind her shadow. They called her the Witch of Warsaw, but no one ever dared say it to her face. In the years before she ever set foot in Warsaw, Ewa Zielinska had already become a whispered legend in the countryside villages, scattered along the eastern borderlands. She had not always been feared, not exactly. In her younger days, she was spoken of as a quiet girl who knew too much about herbs, too much about illness, too much about death. Raised by her grandmother, old Jadwiga Zielinska, she lived in a wooden house deep in the woods near Białowieża, far from the reach of churches or doctors. Jadwiga had been a healer, midwife, and some claimed a witch. But in rural Poland, where the Catholic Church's influence waned and folk beliefs remained strong, the two roles were not always distinct. You were a witch if your remedies worked too well, or if you healed the wrong person. Jadwiga disappeared one night in 1859 during the Prussian purges, dragged from her home by men in uniform and never seen again. Some said she was arrested, others that she had simply vanished into the forest, becoming part of it. Eva, no older than 10 at the time, was left behind. When neighbors eventually braved the forest path to check on her, they found her sitting alone by the hearth, completely silent, a single candle burning on the floor beside a weathered leather book, one that no adult dared touch. That book, some would later claim, was the source of everything that followed. Eva grew up alone with no formal education, no family, and no ties to the outside world. Yet by the time she was 16, women were already coming to her door for help, miscarriages, sickness, infertility, and birth complications that village doctors refused to treat. Eva never turned anyone away. Her remedies worked. Her teas soothed fevers, her tinctures stopped bleeding, and her hands could ease the pain of labor with an eerie precision. But there were always rumors unspoken at first, then louder as the years passed. People said Eva could call animals to her door just by humming. They said she could predict the exact hour a child would be born. And some whispered that she never lit fires, yet smoke always poured from her chimney at night. One child who wandered too close to her window swore he saw shadows on the wall that didn't match the movement of her hands. By then, even those she had helped began to keep their distance. They paid her in coins left on her doorstep and never stayed long enough to speak more than necessary. The air around her home had changed. Something had taken root there, something old. Though she remained isolated, Eva's reputation grew. And with it the stories. According to a farmer's widow from Mielnik, Eva once resurrected a stillborn calf by placing her palm over its heart and whispering in a language no one could recognize. A soldier claiming she knew his exact wounds before he even removed his shirt, and a midwife from a nearby village refused to speak her name after allegedly witnessing her press a dead flower to her lips and have it bloom once more. Whether truth or delusion, the line between healing and heresy was growing thinner, and Eva walked it without hesitation. The book was never far from her. She was seen studying it by candlelight in the dead of winter, copying symbols onto scraps of paper, sometimes burning them in her stove with small bones or bits of thread. No one knew its origin, only that it was old, bound in dark leather with writing that didn't seem to match any known alphabet. It wasn't written in Polish, Latin, or even German, but something else. Something that gave the readers headaches if they stared too long. A priest once offered to take it from her, to burn it in a holy fire. Eva declined with a smile. That priest died of heart failure 2 weeks later, alone in his rectory, his fingers blackened at the tips. When Eva finally left the forest and moved to Warsaw, it wasn't because she was forced to, not in any visible way, but some believe the land itself rejected her. or that the spirits her grandmother had once bound had grown too loud. Whatever the reason, she arrived in the city with only that single trunk, the book, and the skills passed down to her through generations of women who had never been allowed to speak their knowledge aloud. And it wasn't just herbs she brought. It was a kind of knowing, the deep, instinctive understanding of pain, blood, and breath. She could hear the quiet rhythms of a dying body and sense where life still pulsed. It was as if she carried the memory of every mother her grandmother had served, every child that had come screaming or silent into the world, every secret that had ever been whispered between midwife and patient. The city thought it was gaining a simple practitioner, but what came into Warsaw that winter was something far older, something that didn't quite belong in the rational, bustling streets of modern Europe. Eva may have changed her address, but she never left the forest. Not really. It followed her. It was in June of 1887, during an especially stormy night, that the event most townspeople would come to call the turning point took place, the one that would take the whispers surrounding Eva Zielinska and turn them into something colder, sharper, and more dangerous. Up until then, fear of Eva had been contained to shadowed gossip, quietly exchanged glances, and nervous superstitions. But after that night at the old chapel, fear took on a shape with weight, with memory, and with a sound no one could forget. That summer evening had been thick with thunderclouds and restless air. The bells of St. Magdalena's chapel had not rung all day, not due to disrepair, but out of respect. A young couple from the industrial district, barely in the 20s, had lost their first child before it even took its first breath. The stillbirth was difficult, and there had been blood. Too much. When the priest refused to come to the home to bless the baby, claiming the storm and illness as reasons, the family in desperation turned to Eva. She arrived silently just after dusk, carrying a candle, a small basin, and a bundle wrapped in a black cloth. What happened next was pieced together from fragments. No one saw everything. No one wanted to. A drunkard across the square claimed to have seen her walking alone into the chapel, with the bundle cradled in her arms, the storm already breaking over the city. A sexton swore he saw her strike a match inside the nave, though no oil lamps had been filled in weeks. What is agreed upon is this. She was in the chapel after midnight, alone, long after the doors had been locked, and the child's body was never found. The family insisted they had entrusted the stillborn infant to her for a blessing before burial. They expected her to return. She never did. When questioned, Eva said only that the baby had been delivered back into silence, a phrase that chilled the bones of those who heard it. The chapel itself, old and worn from years of disuse, remained closed for days afterward. The smell of damp stone and soot lingered far longer than the storm itself. But it wasn't until weeks later that people began to speak of the sounds. At first, it was dismissed tricks of the wind, echoes in an old building. But soon too many people were hearing the same thing, the faint sound of a baby crying from inside the chapel walls. It always came late at night, always just as the streets grew quiet, and always from the same corner, the alcove where the baptismal font had once stood. Several local children insisted they had heard the crying clearly while walking past the chapel on their way to morning mass. One boy swore he saw movement behind the stained glass, a flickering shape far too small to be a grown person. A carpenter tasked with repairing the leaking chapel roof reported something stranger. He claimed that during a brief break in the rain while he waited alone in the chapel with his tools, he felt an intense pressure in his ears like something trying to hum just outside the range of human hearing. He said it was followed by the unmistakable sound of a baby breathing, not crying, not cooing, just breathing, shallow and slow, from somewhere beneath the floorboards. He left his tools behind and refused to return. The priest, under mounting pressure from the townspeople, finally agreed to inspect the chapel. He was an aging man not given to hysteria, and he had been skeptical of Eva's reputation from the start. But what he found in the alcove turned his skepticism into something quieter, more frightened. He discovered the font had been disturbed. The base had been moved, dragged a few inches across the stone floor, though no one could explain how. Behind it, carved into the stone wall, was a crude symbol circular, incomplete, almost like a child's drawing of an eye crossed with a root. No one recognized it. The stone surrounding it was cold to the touch, colder than the rest of the chapel, even in the height of summer. And then there was the cradle. A week later, one of the altar boys found a wooden cradle sitting just outside the chapel's front door. It was small, old-fashioned, carved by hand in a style no longer used. There were no blankets, no toys. Only a handful of dried herbs scattered inside lavender, yarrow, and something else. A single blackened tooth lay beneath the herbs. The priest burned the cradle in the yard behind the chapel the following morning. The flames hissed, as if resisting the fire. After that night, few people spoke Eva's name in public. The idea that she had somehow conducted a ritual inside the chapel, one that tethered something unnatural to the building, became an accepted truth. Even those who had defended her began to avoid her. The crying was never explained. And whether the child had truly been entombed inside the chapel walls or something else had been summoned in its place, no one wanted to know. From then on, the chapel stood empty, cold, and those who passed it after dark would walk a little faster, their hands clenched tight, ears straining for the faintest hint of that impossible sound. Dr. Kazimierz Wróblewski had never believed in spirits. He was a man of science, educated in Vienna, trained in the modern practices of medicine, and deeply skeptical of Warsaw's persistent reliance on folk remedies and peasant superstitions. When he first heard about Ewa Zielinska, it was through his patients' women who mentioned her name with a mixture of awe and dread, often in the same breath. At first, he dismissed it as typical lower-class mysticism. But as the months passed, and as his own cases began to intersect with hers more frequently, curiosity took hold. It wasn't long before that curiosity turned into something closer to obsession. It began with an autopsy. A young woman named Aniela Vicek died during childbirth, one of many cases in which Eva had been present. Dr. Wróblewski, tasked with identifying the cause of death, found nothing typical. The uterus was intact. There was no hemorrhaging, no sepsis, no stroke. What he did find, and later sketched into his journal, was a fine black thread curled around the base of the heart, so thin it looked almost like a hair, but embedded in the tissue. No one else saw it. The body was buried within the week. He couldn't let it go. He began keeping a private record separate from his hospital notes of every woman who had interacted with Eva. He documented symptoms that made no clinical sense. Inexplicable fevers that vanished by dawn, breathless panic attacks when entering churches, spontaneous bruising in symmetrical patterns, and above all, the recurring motif of sleep disturbances. Dozens of women complained of waking in the dead of night, paralyzed, with a sensation of something sitting on their chests. Others described hearing the cry of a child that wasn't theirs. Several saw a woman standing in their doorway, silent, unmoving, who disappeared before they could scream. These were not isolated cases. Wróblewski cross-referenced them and found something chilling. All had given birth under EWA's care within the same 5-month span. He confronted one of the mothers, a woman named Marta Gliniewicz, about her nightmares. She refused to speak at first, but eventually confessed, through trembling hands, that she had begun hearing her child whisper in its sleep, in a language that was not Polish, nor any she recognized. The child was only 9 months old. His journal began to fill with strange symbols, copies of markings found on the infants' necks, etchings on the walls of Eva's patients' homes, sometimes even on the back of chairs or cribs. Most were circular, often interwoven with lines like tree roots or veins. He attempted to translate them using everything from medical anatomy texts to outdated religious manuscripts, but nothing matched. One afternoon, desperate, he brought his sketches to an old rabbi who had once worked as a scholar of mystical texts. The man took one glance, paled, and handed the paper back without a word. The deeper Wroblewski looked, the stranger the world became. He began to suspect Eva was doing more than midwifery, that she was conducting something closer to a ritual through childbirth itself. There were too many consistencies. The mothers always reported the same incense-like smell. The rooms always grew colder during the last stages of labor, and in several cases birth happened far too quickly, as if induced not by medicine, but command. One woman claimed Eva had spoken a sentence under her breath, and the contractions began instantly, despite having shown no signs of labor earlier that day. His colleagues dismissed his concerns. When he showed them the journal, they mocked the drawings and suggested he take a leave of absence. But Dr. Wroblewski was convinced that something unnatural was taking place in their city, and that Eva was at the center of it. He began following her. Not openly, he was too careful for that, but he noted the homes she visited, the women she spent time with, and how in many cases she seemed to arrive before she was even called. How did she always know? On one occasion, he watched her exit a home after midnight, and saw her pause in the street, gaze upward and murmur something into the air. Moments later, a flock of crows erupted from the rooftops. There was no breeze, no sound, just her voice. The final entry in his journal, found years later, behind a false panel in the wall of his study, was scrawled in haste, the handwriting jagged. It read, "She spoke to something in the room. I couldn't see it, but it moved. It breathed. Her shadow is not hers. I think she knows I've been watching." Dr. Wroblewski vanished days later. No one ever found his body. His home was untouched, nothing stolen, no signs of struggle, but a single candle had burned down to a puddle of wax on the floor beside his desk. On the wall, just above his writing table, was one of the symbols, fresh, as if etched with a fingernail. The summer dragged on with a kind of sick weight after the chapel incident, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Fewer people walked past Ewa Zielinska's home now. Even fewer dared look directly at her when she passed. It wasn't just the rumors anymore, not just the stillborn child, the crying in the chapel, or the whispers of black thread curled around a mother's heart. Something deeper had shifted. It was as if the air around her had changed. And then, almost without warning, she was gone. It was the third week of August when someone finally noticed. Her shutters hadn't opened in days. No candlelight flickered in the window at night. The silver bowl, where neighbors once left coins or bundles of dried herbs usually returned by morning, cleansed or changed, sat untouched and rusting. For a woman so precisely predictable in her comings and goings, the silence was impossible to ignore. A few brave souls gathered outside her building one morning, more out of fear than concern. Among them was a local shoemaker, an elderly woman who had once survived childbirth under Eva's care, and a constable who had always regarded Eva with the kind of caution he usually reserved for corpses that refused to stay buried. The door was locked from the inside, the windows sealed. But as they debated how to proceed, the constable noticed something strange. Faint scuff marks beneath the front door. Not the kind made by boots or dragging furniture, but smaller, lighter, like something had been rocking there, gently, over and over again. When they finally forced the door open, the interior of the home struck them all into a kind of reverent silence. It was not what they had expected. There were no piles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, no bubbling cauldrons or walls of books, as the stories had suggested. The space was immaculate, sparse, almost painfully orderly. A single table with a white cloth, shelves lined with apothecary jars, each meticulously labeled, a small iron stove, and in the center of the room, the cradle. It was wooden, old-fashioned, hand-carved with smooth edges and a dark lacquer, but it was the carvings along the frame that drew their eyes. Intricate, sharp symbols ran along the edge like vines, the same strange, root-like script found etched into the chapel wall. At first it seemed the cradle was empty, but when the constable leaned in closer, he noticed the bedding had been recently disturbed, the indent of a small body still pressed into the fabric. A faint scent lingered in the air, lavender and something metallic, the same scent survivors of Eva's visits always mentioned. And then, without wind, without movement, the cradle began to rock. No one touched it. No one spoke. The room was still, but the cradle moved on its own, slow and deliberate, as if obeying some rhythm the rest of them couldn't hear. The shoemaker crossed himself 3 times and left the house without another word. The others followed quickly after. What followed in the coming days blurred the line between panic and silence. Officials declared her house sealed. No one was to enter. Yet people claimed to hear the cradle rocking from the street at night. Some even claimed to see flickers of candlelight in the upstairs window, even though the authorities had confirmed there was no second floor. A week later, a young woman named Danuta, pregnant with her first child, reported waking in the middle of the night with the sound of lullabies drifting through her walls, old Slavic lullabies her mother never sang. She lived 3 blocks from Eva's home. And then came the markings again. Several newborns born after Eva's disappearance were found with faint impressions on their skin, not bruises, but pale raised shapes, like something pressed into the flesh before birth. One of the midwives said she recognized the pattern, the same twisting shape from the cradle's frame. Another reported a newborn who refused to sleep in any crib, except when it was placed near the direction of Eva's house, at which point it would fall immediately into a deep, unmoving slumber. It was as if her absence had not removed her influence, but freed it. Untethered it from her body. The rituals, if that's what they were, had been completed. Whatever she had put into motion, it now moved on its own. Months passed. The house remained sealed. Snow came. The cradle was no longer visible through the windows, and no one dared go inside to check. But a constable's report, filed quietly and never released publicly, claimed that on one bitter December morning, he saw tiny footprints in the frost leading up to the door and none walking away. There was no official funeral. No declaration of death, only the rocking cradle, the strange marked children, and the lingering scent that sometimes wafted through Warsaw's alleys long after Eva Zielinska was seen for the last time. When Eva Zielinska first arrived in Warsaw during the winter of 1887, she did not come with the presence of someone important. She rented a small flat in the Praga district, a place most well-bred people avoided, a place of narrow streets, broken gutters, and coal smoke clinging to every brick. She arrived without a husband, without references, and with a trunk full of hand-stitched linens, dried plants, and one cradle empty and old, wrapped tightly in canvas. She never offered an explanation for her past, nor did anyone feel brave enough to ask. The city was in no shortage of midwives, but something about Eva made her different. She didn't hang a sign outside her door or advertise in the local papers. She never sought patients, and yet they came, often unannounced, often weeping. And somehow she was always ready, always waiting. Word of mouth carried faster than sickness in those neighborhoods. They said she never refused anyone, not even when there was no money. She asked for payment in other forms: food, a candle, a button from the father's coat. Some said she gave those items back weeks later, changed. It wasn't long before people began to notice the strangeness surrounding her births, not just the mothers, but neighbors. The midwives who passed by on their way to their own calls. They began whispering. Eva didn't labor with the mothers, not in the way most did. She didn't shout instructions or pace or boil water. She knelt quietly beside the bed, sometimes holding the woman's hand, sometimes pressing her fingers to the mother's chest, murmuring words no one understood. The births were fast, too fast. Some barely lasted an hour. And while most children survived a rarity in those slums, there was something wrong with the way they entered the world. A seamstress named Ola Sadowska, one of the first to speak about it, claimed that her son had been born with his eyes open, staring upward into a corner of the ceiling for minutes without blinking. He did not cry for 2 days. Another child, born 2 blocks away, arrived with a faint scar across her back in the shape of a crescent, though the skin had not been broken. These markings began to appear in nearly every birth Eva attended. Some were barely visible, like a raised line under the ribs or a patch of discolored skin on the temple. Others were boulder symbols, strange geometric shapes, etched into tender flesh like some forgotten brand. Still, the children lived, and for many families that was enough. Warsaw's infant mortality rates were brutal, and those in the Praga district had it worst of all. If Eva's methods brought life where there had once only been graves, who were they to question it? But the unease grew. Not just because of the children, but because of what happened to the mothers. There were losses, and not all of them could be easily explained. A woman named Elżbieta died 3 days after childbirth, her lungs filling with fluid despite having no signs of infection. Her sister claimed Elżbieta woke up the night before her death, screaming about a figure sitting at the foot of her bed, not moving, not speaking, just watching. Another woman, Basia, lost her hair in handfuls within hours of giving birth, her skin turning ashen and cold. She survived, barely, but would never speak of the labor again. Her child grew up completely mute. Doctors were no help. They either avoided these homes or dismissed the symptoms as hysteria, exhaustion, or grief. But among the midwives and neighborhood women, a quiet consensus formed. Something unnatural was riding alongside the births Eva assisted, something neither holy nor human. Some even began to believe Eva didn't just help bring life into the world. She brought something else with it. And yet they kept calling her, because fear was a smaller price than burying another newborn in the frozen ground, because hope, even cursed, still looked better than despair. By the time the chapel incident occurred, the people of Praga already knew the truth. They couldn't speak aloud. Ewa Zielinska was not simply a midwife. She was a threshold, a door that opened between things, and not everything that came through was meant to be here. If stories like this send a chill down your spine, tales of forgotten rituals, haunted births, and the thin veil between life and death, then you'll want to hear more. Subscribe to Bloodlore for more unsettling histories, macabre folklore, and true stories that were never meant to be unearthed. Darkness doesn't knock, it arrives. Be ready.